First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. This is a very important evening and talk for our community to talk about a relatively unknown agreement, which is the Trade Investment and Labor Mobility Agreement. In short, it is called TILMA. It was signed in secret a year ago between the Campbell and Klein governments, and it is slated to go into effect in just 5 weeks on April 1st. Yes, that is April Fool's Day. This deal extends privileges to corporations and individuals, allowing them to sue provincial governments and provincial government agencies for any regulation that the corporation deems harmful to their investment and their ability to make a profit. There's a dispute resolution process within TILMA which is similar to the Chapter 11 process in the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the NAFTA. But the dispute resolution process in TILMA actually goes a bit further than Chapter 11, with provisions for multiple lawsuits that can attack perceived restrictions or impediments to trade. And Stephen's going to talk in more detail about what some of these are. Under the TILMA agreement, even provincial or municipal policies designed to protect the environment and public health are vulnerable to attack from corporate lawsuits. In fact, Gary Marr, who's the cabinet minister in Alberta, who signed the TILMA agreement, said that this dispute resolution process is, quote, everything Canadian business asked for, end quote. Immediately on April 1st, most sectors will be impacted by TILMA, but as municipalities have a 2-year transition period, there are still a lot of opportunities for us to impact our future and the future of the province, which is one of the reasons that Stephen is speaking here tonight. Stephen Shrybman is a partner in the law firm of Sack, Goldblatt and Mitchell and practices international trade and public interest law in Ottawa. He currently serves on the board of the Council of Canadians, the Institute of Agricultural and Trade Policy, and as a research associate for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And he's one of 3 Canadian members on the International Forum on Globalization. So please join me in welcoming our main speaker, Stephen Shrybman.
Back again to discuss probably the thing I last discussed in this basement, which was another attempt by the neoliberals to establish their regime of privatization and deregulation and free trade as another instrument that will constrain the capacity of governments to do what ostensibly we elect them to do, which is to represent all of us in the public interest. So I'm going to spend a bit of time describing TILMA, though not probably all that much. And then talk a bit about the rationale that they've offered for foisting this regime on you and the people of Alberta, and they're certainly doing their best to encourage other provinces to take it up. And then a little bit about why I think it's really happening and what this agenda is really about. When you talk to people about this new era of global economic constitutions that represent charters of rights for transnational corporations, the first thing people ask, or often ask, is, well, why would a government agree to disempower itself, to remove from itself the tools of governance? Why would any government agree to that? And, you know, I've never really found an entirely satisfactory answer to that question. I mean, in part, they're simply doing the bidding of their corporate sponsors. In part, they subscribe to the ideology, either because the ideology of deregulation and privatization and governments being smaller and doing less, either because they believe in it and take it on themselves, or because they think it's inevitable and that's the way the world is going and they have no choice but to compete in this new leaner and meaner and harsher world that we live in. But I recently gained a new insight into what the motivation might be when Ontario's Minister of probably international trade, I think, I'm not sure how the portfolio was described, her name is Sandra Pupatella, visited Alberta and met with the folks there that are very much a part of the TILMA enterprise, and talked about how high the Premier of Ontario was on TILMA. And I thought, that's it. It's drugs. They're high on drugs, and that's why they embrace these new regimes. And obviously, they're bad drugs. And the real question is, if they're taking the bad drugs, why do we get to go on the bad trip? So I think that's really, that kind of gave me a whole new kind of insight into, what must be going on and why they would be motivated to sign on to these kind of ridiculous agreements. So before I depress you with the details, let me just telegraph the happy ending, because I think there is one to this. This regime is so absurd, so overreaching, so egregious in its assault on the capacity of governments to govern in the public interest, so absolutely lacking in any rationale or justification that it won't endure. It won't survive. Other provinces will not join on, and you will be successful, I think, in beating it back, and it will wither and die in British Columbia and Alberta. So here's TILMA, the essential elements, and really there are only two. There's lots of complexity when you get into the exceptions, but there are really two essential features of the regime that really matter. The first one is the prohibition against any form of government activity or regulation or conduct or practice or program. There's an article in TILMA that says government shall not, I can't remember the precise word it is, establish or maintain, but in any event, measures, the term is measures, which means in trade speak, anything that government does, and governments do everything from provide services to regulate corporate activity in the public interest and fund programs, and anything that governments do is a measure. So no government shall maintain a measure that restricts or impairs trade, investment, or labor mobility. So that's the key operative thesis of the regime. So just stop and think about that for a moment. Is there anything that a government does that you can think of that doesn't impair trade, investment, and labor mobility? I can't think, it's an honest question, I can't think of anything that a government does. I mean, anytime a government provides a service, for example, healthcare or healthcare insurance, it impairs the opportunity of a private investment or insurance company to provide private insurance. Every time it imposes a height restriction or a land use planning constraint, and impairs or restricts the ability of investors to do what they want with their property. And any time it passes an environmental regulation, every time it funds a social program that's delivered on a not-for-profit basis, it impairs the ability and profitability of investors who want to access those funds, but preside over for-profit corporations. So there really just isn't anything that I can think of that governments do that doesn't offend that broad prohibition. So I mean, the first thing you have to disabuse yourself of is the notion, and I'll speak more about this, that this has anything to do with trade. It really doesn't. It only has to do with regulation and the role that governments play in society, and its only project is to dismantle and limit and reduce and diminish the role of the state to govern in the public interest. So that's what it's basically about. So that's the first and major feature of TILMA. And it goes far further than NAFTA, far further than any of the agreements of the WTO. Those agreements are constrained, I mean, as broad as they are, they're still constrained in terms of their ambit and application. For example, under NAFTA, investors' rights are protected only from discriminatory government measures, though the tribunals tend to read that very broadly, and from activities of governments that expropriate private investment, and there are some rules about performance requirements, but there's a limited list of rules. It's compared with NAFTA, TILMA simply says you can't do anything at all. No matter how inconsequential the impact, it cannot restrict or impair the rights of investors, or trade, or labor mobility. So it's just far broader in its reach and application than anything that they've been able to formulate as an international discipline on discipline on the capacity of governments to do what we elect them to do. So that's the first thing you need to know about TILDA, and one of the reasons I think it's so vulnerable. The second is that, and Kevin already mentioned this, but what really matters about these regimes is how powerful the enforcement mechanisms are that are built into them. That's why we have a very robust kind of sphere of international human rights law, and there are lots of conventions that the International Labour Organization, the ILO, has formulated and passed, and why we have international treaties about biodiversity and climate change that don't mean anything, because they can't be enforced. They don't have meaningful enforcement mechanisms. There are some exceptions to that. The Montreal Protocol on ozone-depleting substances has a credible enforcement mechanism, but it's easy enough to write agreements, and governments are happy to do that and to sign on to them, but often they don't mean very much. And what you need to know is whether there's a credible and meaningful compliance mechanism built into the agreement that will compel governments to comply with the requirements of the instrument. And TILDA has incorporated the most formidable and pernicious mechanism of that kind. It's the one that resides in Chapter 11 of NAFTA and thousands now of bilateral investment treaties. And that is the right of private parties to enforce these treaties and to claim damages where governments fail to comply with the constraints the regime imposes. That is the most powerful enforcement mechanism yet devised, and in fact difficult to imagine anything more influential, to enforce an international agreement. And what's really preposterous about that, of course, is that investors and the private interests that can invoke these treaties, of course, aren't parties to the agreements and don't have any obligations under them. They only have rights and no responsibilities, and yet they can still, in this case, enforce an interprovincial agreement. This is an agreement between provinces, and yet private interests can enforce it. So I'm going to go on. Those are the two key things you need to know about TILDA. Government shall not do anything, and two, if you do, we're going to come and get you and get money in the process. And I'm confident that BC will be kind of an engine of that. And I'm not just saying that because I want to be popular. I do, but I'm saying it because I believe it. Anyway, thank you very much.